Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with Anthea Butler and Kate Bowler about Anthea's new book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. My name is Talia. I'm the events manager here at Flyleaf. If you're new to Flyleaf, I encourage you to browse our full events calendar by clicking the Flyleaf Books logo above us. Our upcoming events focus on topics as varied as Confederate monuments, aging gracefully, and the most beautiful golf courses of the Carolinas. So there's a little bit of something for everyone. Plus, we have events about literary fiction. We have a domestic thriller author coming soon, and we're about to announce a bunch of children's events for June. So stay posted if you're interested in any of those. If you'd like to support Flyleaf and our guests, please keep in mind that Anthea and Kate's books are available from Flyleaf. We are open for browsing, so you can come in to shop, or you can click the link below our faces to buy your copies. Now I will go ahead and introduce our guest tonight. Anthea Butler is Associate Professor of Religion at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World. A leading historian and public commentator on religion and politics, Butler has appeared on networks including CNN, BBC, and MSNBC, and has published opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other media outlets. Anthea, welcome tonight.
Thank you.
And our other guest tonight, Kate Bowler, is an associate professor of the history of Christianity in North America at Duke Divinity School. She's the author of Blessed, A History of the American Prosperity Gospel, which traces the history of the moment based on divine promises of health, wealth, and happiness. Then, after being unexpectedly diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at age 35, she penned the New York Times bestselling memoir, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. Dr. Bowler subsequently staged a national conversation on speaking frankly about suffering through her popular podcast, Everything Happens. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate.
So glad to be here.
All right, so thank you again to you both. To keep the focus on our guests, I'm going to hop out, minimize my screen, and just let Anthea and Kate talk to each other about the book and their work. So if you think of a question you'd like to ask them, please feel free to leave it in the chat or use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the event, I'll pop back up to read those questions out loud. All right, Anthea and Kate, you have the floor.
All right.
Woo, here we are. I am so grateful to be able to talk to a brilliant friend, also my president. Thank you for leading thank you for leading our guild with great.
I know, right? This is so weird.
I honestly can't think of anyone with whom I have more questions about what happened in the last 4 years and beyond. And I know it's so much more than just a presentist story, but thank you. And I have a million questions, and I'm so grateful to get in the mix with you.
And I'm happy to answer as many as I can.
For people who might not have a sense of just how freighted the word evangelicalism is, there's a lot at stake when you lovingly and excoriatingly are look, the word evangelicalism has a racism problem. What do we mean by evangelical? What hangs on that word right now?
A lot, because I think, the word evangelical, if we think about it in a media sense, is related to the last 4 years, especially. And, in America, we don't tend to have a very long historical memory, right? So evangelical gets equated with Trump right now. And I think for a lot of evangelicals, they've tried to figure out, how can I distance myself from Trump, or how can I bring him into a tighter embrace? There is no middle ground. There is either I love him or I'm running as fast as I can away from the label of evangelicalism, right? But for the purposes of the book, what I talk about is this sort of long arc of what this word meant. I talk about it in the 19th century in terms of, people wanting to spread the gospel, thinking about evangelion, right? The Greek word, and how that gets parsed out. And in the 20th century, we think about, this differently, between a difference between fundamentalism and modern evangelicalism, right? And we could go with that route. And then we get a route about, how this gets to be a moral issue word. And then there's a political appellation. But I'm very clear in the book about, I'm thinking about evangelicalism as a political religious movement that has embedded itself in the Republican Party. And I think understanding that arc helps people to understand better what's going on. I should also say one thing. I think also for evangelicals personally, and you know this very well, there's a theological component, right? So what you believe, makes you an evangelical or not, right? And so that's the difference between, somebody who's in Southern California vis-a-vis somebody who's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They would all agree, though, on the Bebington Quadrilateral, right? This is what makes us an evangelical. And for those of you who are out there going, what the heck is that? Don't worry, we're not doing theology today, okay? So, but I think it's a really important moment to say, this might not be the thing that everybody else is operating with. And we need to talk about that and to use a more facile definition of evangelicalism.
Now, I'm sorry to be the most annoying person in the world then, because I do have just one desperate follow-up about the Bebington Quadrilateral. So,
yes.
Because I come from we all have lineages, right? Mm-hmm. Intellectual lineages, ways in which we're formed. And I, along with many other people, were trained to talk about the history of evangelicalism with in an ideational and theological way. Yeah. So would you mind kind of running through the four things that's our little quadrilateral?
You should say the four things because I try to block them out of my mind all the time.
I wonder if I could. It was, oh my gosh,
this
and
the chat section. I'm all like, it's a quadrilateral. I'll think about it.
I think it's evangelism, the desire to convert. Yes. I think it's biblicism.
Mm-hmm. Biblicism, I agree.
Conversionary mindset. And activism. Hey.
Yeah. And we gotta, I'm gonna make sure for all the people out here who are like, what do you mean you don't know the Bebington Quadrilateral? And I'm like, well, I knew it for the book, okay. But I think that I wanted to not use that. I really wanted to not use that because I think this is part of the issue is that this is how evangelicals self-identify, but it also makes a wall. And that wall is that as long as we're theologically correct, then that doesn't mean anything else, right? And so it's like, well, yeah, but you get determined a different kind of way when we talk about you in the press or this, let's get this right. Conversionism.
Dr. Butler, crucicentrism. We have the greatest comments already.
I know, of course they are. They're all like going, these girls don't even know what this is. These ladies don't know what this is. And I'm like, yeah, I do. But, I know. There's like this moment in which you're just like, I'm so tired. And this actually brings up something. Thanks for whoever put that in the chat. But here's the point. The point is that if you define evangelicalism only theologically and only by what a white theologian says, then you cut out everybody else. And you cut out everybody else who might believe this, like a lot of Black, church people do. They believe in every last one of these things. But it means that why aren't they evangelicals, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think this is an internal conversation that we have to have. And I just feel like it's not been good enough. And it hasn't done what it needed to do. It doesn't absolve evangelicals from all the other stuff that happens, but to rest on this theological definition of evangelicalism is very limiting to what evangelicalism actually does in the public, how it works culturally, how the educational systems have worked. I mean, completely about everything.
When I think about I think about how we built, myself included, the way I structure chapters, the way I've set up lectures, it was easier for me to take, I think self-identification has always been a really, I don't know if it's just we all fell in love with our anthropology class, but we're like, that's it. Yes. Self-identification will solve the problem of defining a very amorphous movement. But I'd love, let's get specific then about your critique here is obviously that this approach has severe limitation when it comes to understanding, especially the matrix of race and racism.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's what it has allowed evangelicals to do is to self-define themselves. So whether you use the quadrilateral, whether you talk about this, really great history, we were abolitionists, we did temperance, we did, all of these things, right? We had Billy Graham, fantastic, all of this stuff, right? Oh, that's true. And and what I want to say about this book is that I'm not discounting that history. What I'm saying is I'm making you pay attention to the history that you didn't tell about yourselves. Mm-hmm. And so that history includes slavery. That history includes, the Reconstruction period and the embrace of the KKK and some other stuff. That includes lynching. That includes, being opposed to the civil rights movement. That includes, vilifying certain kinds of groups that didn't fit into, this theological equation. And you use that for moral issues. And you also use that to subject other people in the country to a certain kind of morality that evangelicals did not hold up themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's where I have the tension for me in this book is about telling that story in a tight, compact way that shows the big inflection points about evangelicalism and where they have impinged upon the American story and where they have been less than great. I mean, when you have to talk about Billy Graham as not being the kind, evangelical.
But he was so handsome, Dr. Butler. He was so tall.
But you know what? That handsomeness, and your advisor knows this because I've said it to him. His handsomeness was also the way that whiteness was put out into the world about American religion and being against communism. And so that idea of Billy Graham and all of his southernness and his very tall, handsome self was a way to portray rightness and a way to portray white Christianity in a certain kind of way that everybody was supposed to accept. And so the kinds of things that he says about King, the kinds of things that people are shocked to see in print and say, he really did say this? I think you have to know these parts of these figures who have grasped us and realize that they had foibles too. And that the morality that they talked about isn't quite always the morality that they subscribe to.
I think in terms of saving us from our exhausting presentism, one of the real contributions from your book, and I'm hoping that people can get a sense of the longer arc of what we mean by culture wars and the way that evangelicalism is positioned inside of it. For people who are not just desperate to know these details as much as we care about them. We're talking about, I'm just thinking in its more kind of contemporary iteration, at least 100-year story about how the word liberal gets pitted against the word conservative in this fundamentalist modernist, controversy. And could you give a couple examples just so that in the end, when we're at the family barbecue and are reaching for better examples from our back pocket, can you give some examples of how in this kind of how whiteness has functioned in this culture wars model over the last 100 years?
I think one big area is family. And so the kinds of things we hear about family, well, there's the broken family. We have to protect family. We have to maintain this. This really starts in the 19th century. Before slavery is over, but also really in the Reconstruction period and what the period we call redemption is about, how do you valorize, the white female in the South? How do you set her up over against, a Black woman who is seen to be, licentious, right? Or a Black man who's seen to be a rapist, or, white men who are supposed to protect the family. So in one way, this is about, protection, okay? So the way that it follows out in the 20th century, and especially post-civil rights movement, is, well, the Black family isn't together. We need to help them get themselves together. We need to make sure that we have focus on the family. We're going to target these families in the inner city because it's all horrible. And, there's all these things being led by mothers. So this is where the intersection of evangelical stuff comes in the Moynihan Report, right? Yes. And all of this comes together in a certain way. And then this big talk about the family in the 80s over and against everything else that's going on. I think family is one big way that racism sort of plays itself out. It also plays out in education too. So if we take the arc that I'm talking about in the book from the 1950s, when Brown versus Board comes up in 54, and how segregation academies begin to build up in the South and other places where, they're telling us we have to integrate. Well, we're just going to separate our kids out and say we're in Christian school, right? So nobody thinks about this stuff. So there's that. There's the idea of, if we think about, I don't have him a lot in this book, but Rushdoony, who comes up with the idea about homeschooling and the kinds of homeschooling that you want. And then when you get to the 70s and people don't want busing and you don't want Bob Jones University to, they lose their tax status because, we don't want to have Black people in there. We don't want to have, because we're afraid that, we'll have interracial dating. Then you have a huge problem, right? And then the problem becomes, you can start to see this, whether we're talking about family or we're talking about education or even culturally where, this is where I make the joke. Somebody put on Twitter the other day, it's like, you know, something about Hillsong. I hate Hillsong music. I'm admitting this right now. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. But it's the difference between what people did about gospel music and the rise of Maranatha and all of these things, because it was a certain way to culturally put people in a certain kind of box and certain kinds of songs you were supposed to sing. Because don't come in here singing all those songs that you got to, you know, you get excited about and people raise their hands and stuff. Let's sing this nice Maranatha music. And I'm not picking on Maranatha. I'm just saying that is a cultural kind of whiteness that everybody is expected to get in an evangelical church.
Those are 3 delightful examples. Family, schooling, music. You surprised me with music at the end there. I liked that.
I pay attention to that one a lot, actually.
How am I supposed to get a Christian massage, though, if I can't make my peace with Hillsong? I asked you.
I won't get one. I'm just like,
I will bless you, Lord.
I know it's a stuff, but that stuff really does take you into a cultural world. And I think this is one of the important things that people need to understand, is that there's lots of things that where you think you might not be embedded in evangelicalism. There's lots of things that evangelicals have been, you know, put on the culture. I'm not saying all of it is racist. I'm just saying there's lots of ways that they've influenced on the culture. I mean, heck, I loved Amy Grant when she was out in the 80s and 90s, right? That was like, I was in church then in a different kind of way. It was great. But yeah, now I don't know if I'd listen to all that.
I have some, now this is therapy. Now I get to ask you angsty questions that I've been feeling about the last couple of years. I thought maybe we might talk for a minute about maybe you don't want me to use the word radicalization, but feels like in the Southern Baptist denomination, which is 15 million members strong, that moved from a kind of maybe a Reaganite republicanism into a very Trumpian one. And that seems to have further consolidate this connection between whiteness and nationalism and evangelicalism. I wondered if you could I'm just thinking of all the people who are quoted as authorities in the media for the last 4 years. And I'd love to talk about white evangelical women after, but like, all the, what does the Southern Baptist denomination, and I think it's increasing Trumpianism in the last couple of years, tell us about the trajectory of evangelicalism right now?
It's getting really hard. I used to describe it this way, and you will appreciate this because I'm going to use another kind of thing within the church to talk about it. I used to talk about prosperity gospel as being brittle. And it was brittle because there was no room in that theology to move, right? You had to follow everything to the letter. And I think this is what's happening to the Southern Baptists and other evangelicals who are hardening right now. And the reason why is because they have when you talk about Reagan to begin with, they were with the Republican Party, but they weren't embedded in it, right? So this is the shift I see that happened, is that in the 80s, evangelicals voted for Reagan because they loved Reagan and it was a part of them, and that was the way that they were going, and the ways in which Falwell and other people talked about the moral issues that were going on. What we have seen is sort of this declension, and the declension in part has been racialized, I think, and also a hardening in terms of the boundaries. And I need to bring this up because I think this is really important. There is less of a focus on theology. This is why I say I don't care about the Bevington Quadrilateral, because they don't care about it either, right? What they've done is not made it about what they believe. They've made it about what they need to keep out. And so you start to think about that in the early 2000s, after 9/11, it's Islamophobia, right? And that hardening against, anybody that looks, different or worships different or anything like that. So there's that. We get to 2008 and Barack Obama, we don't really want a black president, and he's going to be this liberal guy who's going to tear us up, and he's not really a Christian, even though he not the ways in which he expressed his Christianity, right? And I think he just kept trying a lot because he just couldn't understand why people were saying this about him. And then when you get to 2012, they're willing to go, gee, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, we'll take the Mormon. And what does Billy Graham Association do? They decide to take down that Mormonism as a cult. Now, as an American religion scholar, I want to say to anybody out here who's Mormon, I'm not calling you that. That's what the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association called you before the 2012 election. Okay. So that's really important to figure out too. So by the time we get to 2016, it's the whole thing falls apart, because I remember watching in 2015 when Trump was doing this, when he went to talk to Bob Vanderplatz in Iowa, and when he's running, and Rubio and all these guys had all the right answers that used to be the answers, right? And Trump came up there and says, I don't care. 2 Corinthians at Jerry Falwell School at Liberty. He basically says, I don't ask God for forgiveness for anything. And they all run to him. And I'm like, what is this about? And so it was clear to me that the racism, this feeling that their very being, the whiteness of the movement, the whiteness that they felt within themselves, whether they could articulate that or not, Trump tapped that mother lobe. And his racial animus and the ways in which he talked about immigrants, the way he talked about Mexicans, everything else, it didn't radicalize them, but it tapped into something that was already there. Because what the Republican Party had been doing all this time is priming them to be ready for that conversation. But they had been in it in a certain kind of way. And so I think, for me, I look at it as I said in one talk that I gave, I said it was the short con and the long con. And the short con was Trump, spewing out this line. But the long con was how people were prepared for this ever since, 19th century.
I see in your, because I care about this on so many levels. As as someone who grew up evangelical in Canada, which every time they asked us to pray out by the pole, we weren't sure why. Why are we praying around a flag? I think it was at the time Jean Chrétien. He doesn't need Jesus to save our country. It's always been I've always felt that push-pull between this desire to have to understand evangelicalism by these moral commitments. And then what I hear you calling us to is just like the boxes inside the boxes, right? Like which is the larger frame around which identity is formed, and in this case, galvanized and maybe even calcified. I wanted to just we've seen some very high-profile departures in the last year of African-American Southern Baptist pastors. I wanted to, I always gave this talk on minority congregations inside white denominations. And, in the Southern Baptist Convention, as you know, there's about, they've got maybe 15 million official as their tally, but maybe about 3,000 African-American Southern Baptist churches, which is up 90% since 2000, about 3,500 Hispanic congregations, about 2,000 Asian congregations. How do we square this evangelicalism that perhaps wants to be defined by a conservative ideology? And we can see that, I think, likely during the many primarily immigrant congregations that I've visited that identify as Southern Baptist, inside of this larger frame you're asking us to examine, which is saying like, this is an identity. It's not necessarily, how do we characterize those two maybe competing commitments?
I don't know that they're competing. And this is where this creates the tension. I think the bigger box is racism, but think about how those congregations are constructed. Those congregations, I know for a fact that a lot of those Black congregations got a lot of money to come into the Southern Baptists and to be there. So first of all, they bought their diversity. And it's not like this is a diversity, like all of a sudden they woke up one day and decided they were going to be Southern Baptists. They were like, oh, so you're offering us this to come into the convention? Sure, we'll come in because we believe all this, but you're offering us a lot of money. So that's one. Two is, I have tensions about, fully integrated congregations too. But when I hear somebody say there's Black congregations and Asian congregations and everything else, I go back to my seminary training and I think about, Don McGavran and others who talked about, and somebody who used to be really big. I'm forgetting his name right now. I can't believe I forget it. This guy. Yes. Yeah. He basically, said, if you had congregations that were homogeneous, that they would grow bigger. This is like your church growth thing. So on one hand, Southern Baptists can say that they have all of this stuff, right? But look at the leadership. You have 6 white Southern Baptist presidents of seminaries saying no critical race theory. You have the White McKissick, who is a huge, huge pastor in the Southern Baptist Convention, who's African-American, saying, I'm done with you all, I'm leaving. and a parade of people going. And so this hardening is bringing out all the racial tensions that are happening. And I think, you made this quote about them having 50 million people, but I think people also need to understand is that this has been declining for the last 10 years. And so between what the Southern Baptists have had to deal with is, so we talk about the Baptist battles in the 1990s. That was Nancy Ammerman's great book, who kind of really outlined all of that stuff. And then we get into the racial reconciliation mode where they're trying to do this, but, it's working only to a certain extent, right? And then they go get themselves some congregations and buy them. And now they're dealing with this Trumpism where you have, Robert Jeffers in Dallas at First Baptist, which was W.A. Criswell's old church, was really racist, right? And, making MAGA songs and having people sing this on the 4th of July. I mean, this is this marriage. I didn't really answer this in the first question, but I think I could answer here. It's a marriage of this white Christian nationalism, and also a sense in which race, works in these contexts to say, but look, we have these people, but what are these people really doing here? Are they props? Are they just to, promote this colorblind, evangelicalism that people purport to believe, that doesn't mean that they really deal with the racial issues and how they should, really interact with each other? What is that doing? And so I think, and in the case of the Southern Baptists especially, I think that they are really at a very dangerous juncture for their denomination, because they got a lot of soul searching to do when they meet in Nashville this June.
Yeah. I love close observers of denominational politics. I wish we were.
I was watching.
I wish there was a text chain for all of my thoughts for this. I thought maybe we might, just because maybe 2 more questions before we turn to other people's questions. And can I just say, we have such gorgeous, gorgeous comments too. And the most highbrow comments ever, where Dr. Brandon Bain is like, are we thinking of C. Peter Wagner? We sure are,
yes,
Dr.
we
Bain.
are thinking of Peter Wagner. Can I just tell one story about this? I can't believe I forgot his name, because I was a student at Fuller right when he was getting ready to leave to go off to Colorado Springs. And I would have to answer the phone all the time. And there would be people who called and would joke and say, hi, is this Dallas Theological Seminary? I'm like, it's not Dallas Theological Seminary, right? And then there would be the people who would call for church growth, right? And I would have to tell them, he has a dedicated number for this. This is what it is. And then it was the people afterwards when he left that were like, well, can you tell me about the Demon Book?
The Demon Book. I have so many thoughts about the Demon Book.
Yeah. So there you go.
You and I both share a deep and abiding research interest and love of the study of the American Prosperity Gospel.
Yes.
I would hope that about 60% of our dedicated brain space is actually shared space that you and I are constantly transmitting between cities.
Mm-hmm.
I, as you know, I love a good ideational theme in which I think largely I'm just comparing to the way that we talked about what we want to perhaps offer a corrective of inside of evangelicalism, which is only thinking of them in terms of their theological commitments.
Yeah.
I structured my book around their theological commitments around faith, health, wealth, and victory. Mm-hmm. And I liked it because it helped me organize my chapters.
Yes.
But I wondered if we could talk a bit about what might be also the frame, if that's one frame, the frame outside the frame for simultaneously the prosperity gospel. That is a movement which has, of course, struggled mightily with its understanding of race, fundamentally because it couldn't see anything, not even racism, perhaps especially racism, as any obstacle to victory here on earth. But then, of course, famous prosperity preachers inside the movement, like Frederick Price, very famously went to war with his own theological dad, Kenneth Hagin, for not grappling with the sin of racism. How, on the other hand, of course, we know that the prosperity gospel is, in a way, a solution to racism by saying that they can erase the problem of inequality. Yeah. So do we think that the prosperity gospel has similar equations to whiteness, or is it part of a different framing? Also, do I need to rewrite the book? No,
I think there's similar framings. I talk in a book about Oral Roberts, and I have a really great graduate student who's working on Oral Roberts right now. And I think that the framing is similar, but how it works out is different. So there's a lot of talk about we're one in Christ. We can be together. We do the integration thing. But Oral Roberts did exactly the same thing that Billy Graham did. Some meetings were integrated, some were not integrated, and then he got, he decided, oh, I'm going to do this, great television show, and I'm going to do these integrated RU singers, right? And that was sort of this message, right? So it's a lot of signaling, but the realities were really very different about what happened. And I think that what happens in prosperity gospel is that there's a lot of virtue signaling and also colorblind signaling, right? So I think about, Pat Robertson, 700 Club, Ben Kinchlow sitting right beside him, TBM, Paul and Jan, they had lots of people. The biggest person I can think about, and this will, make you very happy that I'm going to bring her name up, Paula White. How does Paula White get started? She gets started preaching like, her voice sounds like a Black preacher. She's doing all this stuff, right? But she starts off with T.D. Jakes, with his Woman Thou Loose conferences in the 1990s. And Jakes really made her. And then she ended up in a series of churches. And now, the church in Orlando, I think, has been a predominantly Black church that she took over when the pastor died. And I think, one of the things about this that's really interesting to me is that these are the people who sort of immerse themselves in these kinds of, racially diverse congregations, but they uphold the same kinds of things of whiteness. So I'll use it this way. When Paula White got on and she was praying for Trump and she said, I'm calling on the African angels. I'm like, they're not your slaves. I mean, if we believe that there's African angels, first of all, then why should they come to your aid, lady? I mean, and why would they come to your aid about Trump? I mean, and so it was like this really kind of weird racialized moment where people were making fun of her and making all kinds of memes about her. But I was also thinking about, what does it mean that you're calling African angels? Can't you just call some angels? Why you call African ones to help this guy? So it was really interesting to me. And I think for the prosperity gospel, the tension is always about what comes first. Is it, the capitalism of it and the idea that God will prosper you in all of these ways? Is race just a sidebar that you don't have to see? Because as much as if you get enough money, you can erase race, right? Like, to a certain extent, right? But not always. And how does it work when you are in a church? And let's use Paula White's church, for example, when that person is supporting somebody who is not about you getting anything. Yeah. Right. And so I don't know how to square that away, except to say, I think that prosperity gospel folks have a lot of the same kind of racial problems that evangelicals have. And I think that now they are part and parcel of part of the reason why the definition of evangelicalism is changing, because they have been so overwhelmingly, this is not the days of James Kennedy and, Jim Dobson, right? James Dobson. We know that it's a very different set of people who are sort of running things. And Trump brought in a whole bunch of people who had a different kind of ethos about themselves. And that's what got labeled evangelical. So I think there's a both and problem going on here.
Yeah. Yes. And to what then do they have to sign on to stay in the halls of power? And what a strange amalgamation of theological enemies under the umbrella of evangelicalism right now.
Yeah.
Religious board of advisors. I was like, wow, if you give each of them a knife, I mean, I don't know.
You can't, I mean, for those of us who've been looking at this for a long time, I mean, aren't you just shocked by these people who are sitting together? I'm like going, these people are not together at the lunch table.
I said none of this would happen. I mean, not Trump, but I said that it wasn't necessary because, like the Joel Osteens had bought into the therapeutic man, and the therapeutic man doesn't need a political apparatus. I thought the therapeutic person simply needs self-esteem, positive declaration, and neo-capitalism. Yeah. And then, a couple years too, Gloria and Kenneth Copeland, just joyful religious board of advisors members for Trump, and I can eat my words. So, perhaps one last question about this is sort of on the nature of the kind on the intersection between white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. As we mentioned, like so many of the folks who became the kind of religious exoskeleton for Trump in the last couple years were, we'll set aside the prosperity women, were men of a certain sort with a certain vision of masculinity, and and you know that I have been very interested in the largely white Christian evangelical influencer woman.
Yeah.
They were, I talked to maybe about 100 or so during the election process and of the leadership, and they were very ambivalent about their personal politics. They were the kind of thing like, well, you're not allowed to publish this, and very concerned about not wanting to address politics publicly, not wanting to have to openly identify with Trump, but simultaneously being too nervous to alienate that audience. I can't tell if we can just say, well, maybe this is just the therapeutic, this is the where the market is, that there's such a gendered aspect to where people want to make money on this, and then pretending to be apolitical is just part of not wanting to disrupt the market. Tell me where to go with this.
I think that's part of it, but I actually think there's another part, and it's back to Beth Moore again. I think it's this issue of complementarianism, that they feel like this is not my realm, because this is a man's realm to talk about politics, and so I'm not going to talk about that. And then the other part of it is that, I just remember that picture. I don't know if everybody remembers this. That was, right after the election of Trump in 2016. And it was at the Women's March on the day of the inauguration. There was a Black woman with that sign that says, "White women voted for Trump," and that was the reminder, right? And I'm like, yeah. And the reason why I say that is because these are the women who do want to talk to you about it, but they went in that booth and did what they needed to do, which was vote for Trump. And they voted for Trump, not so much because they thought he was the best man, but they voted for protection. They voted for somebody who they thought could protect them and could continue their lifestyle the way that it was supposed to be, right? And so I think that was the thing that they wanted to really think about when they went into the booth. And I think that they told you these things because it's uncomfortable for them to talk about it. But I'm sure when they're sitting down talking to their husbands or their immediate friends, they're like, well, yeah, I went in there and voted for Trump. Of course I voted for Trump. So that's one part. The other part about the nationalism part is this. There is a sense, and I told one story in the book about this, where, obviously white gets equated with Christian and America, right? In a certain kind of way. And I think especially with the run up to how all of these churches talked about, how this was going to take away everything and all of this, that what we saw, with the Jericho March. Did you ever think we're going to see a Jericho March like this? And for those of you who don't know, a Jericho March is a thing you do when you're trying to, pray over a certain kind of place or whatever. And it's amazing. But I never thought I would hear them talk about a Jericho March about DC and then have the insurrection happen. But those two things were of a piece. And it was about, how do we save the nation? Because for evangelicals, it's always, Trump tapped into a narrative of declension. Things are terrible. I'm the only one that can save it. Yeah. And that fits into the evangelicals' way of thinking that the world is going to come to an end, except the problem is that most evangelicals really don't think the world's going to come to an end and Jesus coming back, because all the things that they're doing are making themselves comfortable right now. And so this is where I feel like the disconnect comes in for evangelicals. But the one thing that they are really always connected to is the idea that this is a Christian nation, or else you wouldn't have David Barton and all these people writing these things, right? And writing the books and doing all that stuff. It's a Christian nation. It should be white men over it. Everybody else has a purpose in it. But we're the ones that need to be in charge because we have the right morals and the right moral authority to help everything happen, except they don't.
Well, now I need an epilogue to both my books. Dr. Butler, this was fantastic. I really hope we can take some questions now, because we have apparently the smartest audience in the world. So let's begin.
All right. Yeah, I'm happy to read off some questions for y'all. So first off, Leah asks, where do you see the state of American evangelicalism heading in the next 5 years?
Ditch. And I don't, if you wanted one word, but now let me say it a little bit further. I mean, I think there's several problems. One is, if you look at the Pew reports about, church attendance and all of this, that's going to be a huge problem. That's one. Sorry, I feel a sneeze coming on. That is a very big problem because evangelicals are mostly older right now. The younger evangelicals are either self-identifying as something else or identifying out of the movement. So this is a real problem. That's one problem. The second is how does this relationship with the Republican Party continue? It is that the religion has these churches have embedded themselves within the party. And so if the party goes down, they go down. If the party continues to harden in the ways it is with all of these kinds of things that are happening right now, then they get tainted a certain kind of way, right? Everybody thought that the game was for evangelicals was to get rid of Roe versus Wade, right? That was the upshot of why you had to do all of this stuff. And so I think the third piece is if that falls, there will be such a hue and cry in the land that they will be instantly, they already are kind of pariahs, but it's going to be bad, okay? And this is going to be a real war. It might not just be a culture war. It might be, it might be really intense, I think, for people. I think the fourth thing is that they will find themselves increasingly on the fringes of society. I think this is a very big existential problem. And the reason why I say that is because of the piece that was in the New York Times on Monday about the vaccine, right? Lots of evangelicals won't get the vaccine. So this means that not only are you going to be on the margins, but you might die. And this is not something that I think they want to think about. They would think it's their time, but I think this is a problem. And then finally, I think that if the hardening continues, then especially with what happened in Atlanta, I think it's not just Black evangelicals that walk away. I think Asian American evangelicals walk away. I think Latino evangelicals, peel off from these groups. I think they lose a lot of what is going on right now that they have tried to cultivate in terms of ethnic relations. And I think those things are going to sour.
Kate, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just the image in my mind when you're saying that is just the idea of what happens in a culture war is you just take on more and more baggage and weight, in part because you thought you were going to shore up another project. Like, no, I'm load bearing. But in doing that, then you're drowned under every issue that wasn't technically, theologically supposed to be a first order issue.
Yeah.
And
can I answer a question that was in the chat from somebody I know? The person said, what do you think the culture wars around trans kids are really about for evangelicals? I'm like, it is exactly this idea of complementarianism, first of all, with gender and establishing gender roles and making sure that there's no room for anything else. So you can't have LGBTQI anything. They don't care about that. And it's like, it's the next thing from the bathroom wars. I kind of think about this as every 4 years we have a cycle of things that people have to get on board about. And it's two things. One, it's punitive because it's cultural punitism about we don't want to do this. And so now if you have a kid who basically, espouses another gender, I can't remember what state it is, they want the parents to write or they're going to contact the parents from school, right? Or they're not going to let them play sports, or they're not going to do these other things. It's this selecting, trying to, push out anything that is not what they think is supposed to be the correct biblical order. But at the same time, it's also this way in which to punish people and to make them pay for the kinds of things that they won't pay for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Also, just Dr. Butler, you're going to see me do the most embarrassing thing in the whole world. My battery was at 100% when we started, and it's
you need to plug
to die. So I will be right
get a plug. I'll answer another question while you're gone. Get a plug. So give me another question.
There's definitely some of that legislation going on in the North Carolina General Assembly right now. So if anybody watching wants to contact your representatives, definitely encourage you to do that.
Because I promise you, these churches have a lot of money. It's not just the churches, it's the parachurch organizations like Focus on the Family, Family Research Council, all of those. They are, big lobbyists, and they spend a lot of money on this stuff.
Right. Yeah. So we need to put some pressure on our representatives if we want those things to not come to pass. All right, let's see. Speaking of schools, Candace asks, homeschooling and homeschool curriculum have spread neo-Confederate ideology. What can we do to reclaim civic education based on real history?
Oh my God, I'm telling you, if there's any class that needs to come back, it's civics, because I don't think that people even understand how the three branches of government work, let alone anything else. And I think this kind of neo-Confederate education that you see in homeschooling it also happens in the textbook wars. I'm from Texas, and we had massive textbook wars, and the ways in which, these states and local governments have kind of, school boards and everybody who pick out books right now. This becomes very important, and it's sort of a way in which you get this thing. So like by the time they get to me, at Penn, I've had homeschool students go, well, I didn't know this about slavery. And I'm like, yeah, I know you didn't know, because the material that you got didn't tell you anything. And you can't, what they're doing is making their children not functional in this world. And that they are creating a world that has a certain kind of truth, and that truth isn't the truth. It's not even a fact. It's just sort of this kind of like, the lost cause wasn't that bad. Everybody was good. Let's not talk about the thousands of people who were lynched or beaten or raped. But, it was great. It was about Southern culture. And I think this is the worst kind of stuff you can do. But again, I mean, if you want to think about a good book, there's a great book by Julie Ingersoll that talks about this. And I can, anybody hits me up on Twitter at Anthea Butler, I will tell you, I'll put you in touch with her, where she talks about this whole construction of this kind of homeschool education through Rush's Rushdoony.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking too of Seth Dallon's book, Family Values.
Yes, Seth Dallon's book is good too.
I think it's such a strange contradiction that a culture, that a movement that is so desperate to be cosmopolitan, it wants so much to have the honorary degrees and to be in Washington, yet it could also struggle with such an intense, isolating solipsism.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So Catherine asks, can you speak to how non-denominational folks fit into this? What about evangelicals who are not Southern Baptist, or those who have markers of evangelical culture, but don't know that they're part of that category?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting question, because I can start thinking about emergent churches and other kinds of churches that would fit in this, or, I like to think about my people in Michigan who are all Calvinists, who are coming out of Calvin College and all this. Where do they fit in? They fit in a lot, because some of them have actually structured up the theologies that we're trying to deal with, first of all, at least the high theologies of evangelicalism. Part of it also, I think they fit in terms of how they deploy certain kinds of things. So, if you go to a worship service of a non-denominational church, who's at front? What are they doing? What does the congregation look like? How are they voting? What are the kinds of things that they're supporting? And I'm going to give you an example of somebody. I'm going to forget his name, but I know Kate will know this. Who's the guy that was going around spreading COVID, singing songs all the time and having those services? You know who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. And someone in the comment section will add it now.
Somebody will add it now. You all know who I'm talking about. He came to Atlanta. He was in Nashville. He did like these big services, and they were always sort of breaking the rules. And I was hoping that somebody who was an epidemiologist was following everywhere he was going to see what the outbreaks were like afterwards, because he was like, we just want to worship Jesus. We're just free. And I'm like, no, you're not. You don't even care about these people. Thank you, Seth Felt, whatever his name is. I can't pronounce it. Thank you, Susan. But yeah, he's really something else. He really went out, and I think about him in terms of this, because he looks like the nice surfer boy, right? He's doing all this stuff, but he is espousing a very particular kind of, religious freedom idea that doesn't account for anything. Government can't stop me. God is the government. I'm not going to pay attention. It's all the same Republican kinds of ideals, but he's doing it in a very different way, because he's doing these like worship services and things. So I think, looking at him is actually a good way to try to understand how this is working. And there are people, it's a mixed group of people. There are people from different races there and everything. And I think, this is fine. But his centering himself as the person who's doing this, again, is a certain kind of whiteness that, permeates this, that I am the guy who can do this, and I don't have to worry about what everybody else is going to do, because God has given me authority.
Do you remember also it was Michael W. Smith, and I was like, A2 Michael W, where it was, lifetimes. Apparently lifetime's far too long to live as friends. You're going to be playing the piano in the middle of thousands of people. Yeah,
I know. It was just really amazing to me that they did not care. But it was that same thing that happened, when we started seeing, churches, that the guy who got arrested in Louisiana, and there was somebody down in Florida, and all of the stuff, and all of that was essentially about religious freedom. There's a strain there of, because I am who I am, I should be able to do what I want. I am a white man. And therefore, if I'm a white man who wants to worship God, then you should just leave me alone because that's my God-given right. And I'm like, not exactly. You got to go through some things. John MacArthur in California was one too. So there are lots of different people like this. And I get that people wanted to meet and be together during this virus, and we're still going through this pandemic, but we almost have 600,000 people dead. And some of those people probably went to those, sang at those things or got sick from somebody who went to one of those things. And I don't see any remorse on their part for anybody who's dead.
Yeah. Sorry if you can hear a little bit of noise. My dog is chewing on a bone behind me.
It's all right. We're doing bones too, but they're just a little different.
Let's see. There's a question here from Allison who asks, are there particular stories or threads that you had to cut from the book that you wish you could have kept in that you can tell us about?
That's a fun one.
Yes. There's one particular big story that I would have liked to talk about. I would have liked to talk more about Black evangelicals in their relationship to white evangelicals, like Tom Skinner and Bill Pennell. Bill Pennell is somebody one of the people I dedicated the book to, because, they really lived through a kind of a crucial time in the 60s and 70s and 80s about this. And Bill Pennell actually had a book that came out while I was at Fuller called The Coming Race Wars, where he's been watching this for all this time. And then in the 90s, of course, when, the Rodney King verdict came down, we had this huge thing in Los Angeles. And that really, kind of colored the way, and I use that word specifically, colors the way in which people looked at each other in LA in the sort of evangelical world, right? And how they panned out on either side of that. That's one story that I would have liked to pursue. The other story, I think, is the story that how women dealt with this racially and how that also played out. And I think, I wish I could have spent some more time on Phyllis Schlafly because I think she's a big figure. I did not spend a lot of time on the person who I almost wrote a book about, Sarah Palin. She is somebody who is the mother of Donald Trump and the mother of that kind of racial animus, except, nobody knew how to deal with it when it happened, but she deployed it in such clever ways that it was hard to say, well, this is racist. But it was just this moment in which she was able to latch, because she could say some things about Obama that McCain wouldn't say. It really made it very tense during the October of 2008. And I would have liked to have spent more time on that, but I didn't. I think those are the stories. And maybe the third story was a piece of time that I had to necessarily leave out. And I would say that was from the beginning of the fundamentals until the creation of the National Association of Evangelicals, because there's racial things that are happening there too, but that would have made the book really too long. And there's a lot of filler in there that needs to happen, but there's a recent book that just came out on Black fundamentalism that I think will be really interesting, that can kind of speak to some of the things that I couldn't get to in the book.
Thanks for that. And there are a couple questions about expanding on things you said, or folks, other theologians or figures in evangelicalism. Patricia asks what both of y'all think about Robert P. Jones, and Bob asks about expand on what you said about Daniel Moynihan.
I've done a couple of events already, and one more this month with Robert P. Jones. So obviously I think he's great. I think we're telling a different kind of, our stories are similar. His story is more about his growing up, and he's somebody who, runs a whole center where they're doing, lots of quantitative things. I'm not a quantitative person. I'm not a sociologist. So that's his line. And I think both of his books are really good. If you read them in tandem with this book, I think it gives you a really full picture about what happens. And so I think his first book especially, when he talks about the end of white Christian America, that was probably frightening for a lot of people, but I also think it's true demographically. And I think that that's something that, his former denomination, the Southern Baptists, and everybody really have to think about. So I like his work. I think that it's solid. So that was the first question. And the second question was about Moynihan. Oh, well, Moynihan Report was like, I can't remember, 67, 68, where basically he's talking about the breakdown of the Black family and what it looks like in the inner city and all of this. And so when I use Moynihan Report as a shorthand, what I use that to say is like this sort of idea about what people think about Black families. I mean, if when you talk to people sometimes in evangelicalism, it's like, you don't have a family or something, or like you don't come from a 2-parent family. And I'm like, why are you talking like this? Well, I realize it's because they've read all this literature. And I can't remember who it was telling me this. It's one of my friends who was saying she visited, I don't know if it was Family Research Council home office or how they had it, but they had a whole thing up about the Black family, as though it's like, this is the thing you have to preserve. And so I think one of the things that is really interesting, and I wrote about this in the book back in 2016, and I'm forgetting the title right now, but the piece I wrote was about Black conservatism. And one of the things I think is really interesting about all of the abortion talk is that this MAFA 21 organization that was really putting up posters in places like, Atlanta, billboards and things about, well, the Black family is being killed and you shouldn't abort your babies, and these kinds of statistics that they have out about this is really important, because they really want to make sure that, we're paying attention to the Black family. We don't want you to have an abortion, but we also don't think that you have a family unit that's able to take care of a baby. It's like a strange tension about wanting to save Black people on the one hand, but at the same time thinking that they're not morally incapable of doing the thing that they're asking them to do.
Mm-hmm. Can I say something nice about my lovely friend here before we close? Do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
This book came at a great time for me to read. I hadn't been able to yet get a little more language for the kind of for what happens when a movement that saw itself as moving further and further toward the center of a culture then is experiencing a kind of simultaneous ascension and decline. And you've offered us new language. You've, I think, challenged a lot of people internal to our guild and also in the broader public to think more critically about it. And you do it with so much fun on Twitter. I hope everyone here follows her online so you can see this powerful mind at work. And I'm really grateful you gave me the chance to do this with you today.
Well, thanks, Kate. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, part of a lot of this, the back work of this book has been through 11 years on Twitter, tweeting about stuff and talking about it when it happens. And it just kind of clicked like a Lego. So
yeah. Well, it's been a joy.
Yeah, of course. So thank you both for coming out. One last thing, a question I like to ask at the end of events. Is there anything else you're working on or want to promote? And then what are you currently reading?
Oh, that's a great question. What am I currently reading? I could actually turn around and show it to you. So hang on. The Undocumented Americans. That is what I'm reading right now. And it's great. That was a suggestion of one of my friends. And I'm really interested in this because, I'm from Texas and I'm trying to think about the border and lots of different things. And what was the other one? What am I working on? I am secretly working on an essay right now for something very big that will be coming out, and people will probably yell at me about it. So, yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that.
Watch your Twitter, I guess.
I can't contractually talk about it. Probably. I'm going to be working on it right now. So, yeah, it'll be very interesting for people to come out when you read it when it comes out. Yeah.
And Kate?
I have a new memoir coming out in the fall called No Cure for Being Human. It's my very sad. I'm looking at cultural stories about how we think about how we spend our time and whether our lives are. Yeah, it's just been a way of thinking about life as a chronic condition. And the book I'm reading right now is actually a series of essays by the School of Life folks on being nice, because I wasn't feeling very nice lately.
Oh, I should probably have that book emblazoned on, tattooed on my back or something. I'm being nice.
Yeah, mixed bag.
Great. Sorry. It's so interesting to see what y'all are reading. I love, asking that question because it's kind of like people watching, which I love. So just in conclusion, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. To both of you and to everyone watching, if you'd like to order a copy of White Evangelical Racism or other titles from Anthea and Kate, you can click the link just below our faces. You can also find copies of either of the books that they just mentioned. We definitely can order those for you as well if you're interested. And then if you missed some of our conversation tonight, or you'd like to share it with a friend, you can refresh the page right after we're done, and it will show up as a video that you can share out. And please do check our schedule for upcoming events, because we've got a lot of fun things on tap this season. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks again to Anthea Butler and Kate Bowler for spending their evening with us.
Thanks, guys.
Kate.
Next time I'll
Thanks,
plug. Bye.
Bye-bye.